gravity, right? We've learned the basics. You've done an experiment. You wrote a paper, right? We've briefly introduced the topic of tropisms here, but now we're going to go a little bit more in depth as to how this actually physiologically works when it comes to responding to gravity, right? So, tropisms, right? A growth response to some sort of external stimuli, right? That growth might be towards or against a stimuli. Right? We looked at phototropism, right? Plants' response to light, and we saw how auxin plays a huge role in responding to light at the tip of the growing shoot there. Right? We looked at gravitropism a little bit, and we'll expand upon it today. Right? So growth in response to gravity. I did want to mention another tropism, right? Thigmotropism, which I think is a fun word to say, right? Thigmotropism is a growth in response to touch, right? So a lot of plants that will exhibit thigmotropism might be like vines, right? They're vining up, they're responding to what the vines are interacting with in order to grip onto that surface and grow even taller, right? Bean plants, right? Climbing bean plants, a really great example of this, right? If you are interested, you can look up time-lapse videos of this. But as bean plants grow, they actually have this long vine that will circle around and grow longer and longer until it reaches something to grasp, and then it'll grow onto that thing that it has caught in its grasp. Right? So plants are amazing in how they can respond. One of these responses of thigmotropism is this mimosa plant. It's like a sensitive plant. Did I forget captions?
No, it's just I was just asked if it's being recorded.
Yes, it is being recorded. Thank you. I didn't want to forget since we had a few people out today, so thank you for reminding me. But I did forget captions, which as soon as I saw your hand go up, I'm like, I forgot something. There we go. So, thigmotropism here, response to touch. This sensitive, we used to have one of these in the greenhouse. They can be kind of tricky sometimes to keep alive, so they are no longer in the greenhouse. It's actually a really cool response where the plant is responding to that touch by like immediately letting the water go back into the stems, and that causes the leaves to kind of collapse in on themselves, which makes it look like it's not as attractive for herbivores to maybe munch on this plant, right? So it's some sort of a predator defense, or I should say herbivore defense mechanism. All right. Well, like I said, we're going to focus on gravity. All right. So we're going to focus on our gravitropism here. All right. We know some basics, and I just want to go over the basics here. So plant's orientation in response to gravity, right? It can be positive, right? So it grows with gravity, right? With gravity would be growing down like our roots. It can be negative and grow against gravity, right? So it grows up, right? Stems, leaves, right? Gravity is a very interesting stimuli, external stimuli, because unlike stimulus to touch, right, or unlike even light, right, gravity is always constant, right? You can't turn gravity off on Earth, right? So it's always constant. There's no gradient of gravity, right? It does not vary. It's just always there. All right, so we have positive and negative tropism, or gravitropism here, but there's actually more to it than just growing up or down, right? If you look at a plant, it's not like a bean pole or like a stick in the ground, right? There's many other angles in which it is growing, right? There are terms for everything in plant biology, so there's terms for this type of growth as well, right? A plant can be diagravitropic, which means it can grow at a right angle to the pole of gravity, right? So if we look at our image here, leaves are a good example of being diatropic, right? They're kind of growing outward at an angle, right? Horizontal to the ground, but 90 degrees from the force of gravity. Right? Anything less than 90 degrees, right, would be plagiogravitropic, right? These are some complicated terms here, right? They grow between 0 and 90 degrees. So that may be like a leaf growing up from the stem that's not quite growing straight up, but rather growing at like a slight angle. Okay. There are other parts of the plants that are going to grow with little regard to gravity, right? They don't really care about gravity. These would be agravitrophic, right? If we look at maybe some of these tertiary roots, right? Yeah, they're growing down, right? They're not going straight down. They're just kind of exploring the soil, right? Their purpose is to explore the soil. They're kind of growing with little regard to gravity, right? So there's way more than just up and down, and that's a good thing, right? Because if plants only grew up and down, oh, I thought I had an image there. There we go. If plants only grew up and down, right, you'd be cutting off all of this other growth from the plant, right? The plant would be missing out on a lot of like surface area that it could be acquiring these resources, which is the whole point of why plants respond to gravity, right? Roots need to grow down to acquire water nutrients. Stems need to grow up and out, right? So they're capturing as much light as possible in their surroundings to make sugars, right? So this differential response to how they're responding to gravity is basically filling up all the space that it possibly can, because plants can't move around, right? So they have to fill up their available space to capture as many resources as possible, right? And so if they only grew up and down, capture very few resources, right? But with all those different angles that they can acquire, right, they are making the most of what they have. All right, we're going to talk about gravitropism in the roots, right, because there's been a lot of really great studies in the roots. And we know quite well how plants respond to gravity in the roots. And so if we look at root anatomy, right, and this is just so you're aware of what parts of the roots that we are looking at here, right? An active root growing tip is kind of divided into 3 sections, right? Now these sections are not hard, fast lines. They kind of blend into each other, right? But we have an area towards the root tip here, right, which would be the area of cell division, right? This is where we find actively dividing cells. This is where we find meristems, right? Is this area of cell division, right? We're finding meristems there. We know meristems, they produce cells, but cells that don't quite have a specific function yet, right? So our area of cell division here, right? It also contains this feature at the very end called the root cap, right? The root cap is not part of the meristem, but rather it's this coating of cells, if you will, that protects the meristem, right? Roots are exploring through the earth, right? Soil can be very abrasive, right? And so this root cap is here to protect our meristem so that our meristem is not being damaged, right? Basically, it's like a shield, right? It's easy to dent and take away some of these root cap cells, right? That's no problem. Plant doesn't mind, as long as that apical meristem is protected, right? And in the process, they actually secrete some mucilage to help lubricate the roots' movement through the soils, right? So it's a pretty interesting area. It actually plays a pretty important role in sensing gravity. Right? Above our area of cell division, we have this area of elongation, right? This is where these cells that have actively been growing and dividing in the apical meristem now begin to grow in size. They're elongating, right? And then we have this area of maturation, right, where these cells actually get a specific role, right? They become differentiated. They might turn into xylem or parenchyma cells or dermal cells. All right, we dive into gravitropism, right? There's going to be 4 steps that happen when plants sense a change in gravity. Right? First is perception, transduction, transmission, and finally response. And we'll elaborate on each of these steps here. But what I want to emphasize on this slide is that plants respond to gravity pretty quickly, right? So each of these steps happens pretty fast, right? Perception, less than a second for plants to perceive that change in gravity, right? For plants to respond to gravity in the next few steps here, that second step takes like 1 to 10 seconds. Right? Transmission takes 10 seconds to 10 minutes, which is the longest of the steps here, but still 10 minutes in a organism that doesn't move, right? That's pretty cool. Right? And then finally we have that growth response, so how they change their growth, right, in response to how they perceived gravity. Right? So this happens very, very quickly in the cell. And we're going to start by talking about perception first. Right? So perception happens in that root cap, right? That protective lining of cells surrounding our meristem. If we look at the root cap, right, we can see that in the middle of the root cap, we have these cells that are kind of the central core of cells here. We would say these are the columella cells, right? These have the most influence on how plants perceive gravity, right? So these middle section of cells in our root cap, these columella cells. Surrounding our columella cells, right, would be the peripheral cells, right? One or more layer of cells kind of surrounding that middle column of cells. They don't play as much of a role, right? But they're, you can think of it as like the dermal cells to the columnar cells. They're kind of protecting this innermost portion of the cap here. Right? Now we know the root cap plays an important role. Just like in phototropism, where they did those experiments where they removed the tip of the plant to see if the plant responded to light, right? We know if we remove the tip, or remove the root cap, right, so the very, very tip of the plant here, then the plant will not respond to gravity, right, in their roots. So perception happens, right, in those columella cells in our root cap, right? Those cells specifically, right, are called statocytes, right? So our columella cells contain these cells called statocytes, and any cell containing a starch grain, right, would be a statocyte. Now these starch grains play a huge role in perceiving gravity. Right? There's many, many, many starch grains in a cell, and these starch grains can be clumped together. Right? We can see these little black dots in all of our cells here, right, into what's called an amyloplast. Right? So it's like clumps of these starch grains. Now, when a plant is growing, these amyloplasts, they're heavy, right? And as the root is exploring and growing out, right, these amyloplasts are going to fall in the cell in response to gravity, right? So we have here a plant root that is growing down, right? Gravity is pushing this plant down, right? The influence of gravity is coming from the top. We can see that these amyloplasts, right, these heavy starch grains, are falling to the bottom of the cell, right? Plants can recognize that. Plants can perceive these starch grains falling, right? So that is this first step here. It's just perceiving that these amyloplasts and these specialized cell types have fallen to one side of the cell. Once they perceive that these starch grains have fallen to one side of the cell, right, then there's going to be a series of reactions taking place, right? The cell itself is going to produce a series of signaling molecules in our next step, in transduction here. Right? It's actually really hard to find a picture of these signaling molecules, hence why this picture here is a little darker here, right? But in this picture, we can see in the bottom here, we have these starch grains that have fallen, right? And the plant, in response, is producing some signaling molecules that will lead into our next step. All right, so our next step is that these molecules, these signaling molecules, is going to, right, activate auxin. We've seen auxin before. Auxin plays a huge role in phototropism, also plays a huge role in gravitropism, right? So auxin, again, right, is going to be produced. It's going to be transported to those root cells, right? And it's actually going to fall to the bottom of the root. And wherever these auxin hormones are, right, it's going to inhibit elongation. Right? So essentially, now we have auxin that's been transported to these cells. It has also fallen to one side. Right? This side is not going to grow, right? But the opposite side will grow. So now we have one side, again, growing faster than the other, just like we saw in phototropism, which causes a curve to start in our root. Right? It's telling it to curve and grow in an opposite direction. All right, so auxin, many roles in a plant, two of which are phototropism and gravitropism here. Right? And that last step is simply the response, right? Simply growth. Right? So the plant is going to grow, right? Auxin's inhibiting one side of the root from growing, which means it's going to start curving. And we can see that here, right? Here we have satellites towards the right side, plant is growing straight. Here we have satellites falling towards the opposite side of the cell, or maybe the bottom side of the cell here, right? And the plant tip is starting to curve down. I also think this is a great image because you can see clearly this root cap and how it has kind of this mucilage material that's being secreted, right? Kind of that slimy material that we see. All right, well, what if we take away gravity, right? Which is all what this class is about here, growing plants and microgravity, right? Well, we actually find that if we take away gravity, there's not a huge difference in growth response, right? If we take away gravity, the plants instead rely on light as their cue, right? So light is typically going to be given to the plant from the top, right? And so plants will respond to that light source rather than the gravity input, and it's going to grow in pretty much the same way, right? So shoots tend to grow a little bit more upwards, right? Because they don't have to contend with gravity. They don't have to fight against gravity to grow upwards, right? And really what this work is finding is that auxin, yes, while hugely important, is not as regulated by gravity as we thought. So if we had never done these experiments in space, we never would have known that auxin, which we say is this huge regulating molecule in perceiving gravity, might not be playing such a role as we thought. Right? Now again, research is ongoing, right? But it's kind of a cool result of these experiments. Actually, 2 years ago, I was able to get a researcher who actually worked on these APEX experiments to talk to our class, and they're finding some really interesting things. A lot of it's kind of in the genetic level that goes a little bit beyond of what I can explain in a month, but some really interesting stuff. I wasn't able to get him this year. He just got married, is having a baby. He's super busy. All right, I have a couple of questions here for you to kind of digest that information. I didn't realize, now watching that video again, that they actually answered this last question here. So maybe if you picked up on it, that might be an easy one here. But let's answer some questions.
Yes.
I was going to say, driving down to Texas.
Oh, wait, I
I did a field trip when I was a student here. We went to the eastern part of Texas. 3 hours. Which was like the first
down there and back. And I was like, he's like, no, it's too rough.
Hey, where do you stand? Go to the.
All right.
I'm pretty sure you have the has the U.S. Army thing on it.
We're saying the same.
So,
You said,
so
thank
you
you.
know what's there.
They're like the plan.
It still is able to draw.
Let's go over here.
I don't know, when I'm confused, I'm not able to.
Yeah. Learning how it happens.
Yeah, we're like talking stuff, but yeah, just like one of the steps I wrote like the cells and like the potatoes. Class by like, I didn't write a sentence about like what is actually happening in the step, so that's why I was like asking it to clarification with the other people. Yeah. Yeah, and then response.
It's going good here?
Yeah.
Perfect.
No actual.
Doing good?
Yeah, we just flew through it. I actually.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I've never gotten to that.
Wait, I think the animation was videos of like for this material, so I was like really into it.
It's like a very simple video. Yeah. Yeah. I'm only having a great library parts, new parts.
Also, I have like take up this microphone. I have a dashboard.
It's actually pretty fun.
Right?
It's tough. I usually go pace.
And that report that you did. But the last time
Like,
I was
oh, it's literally just oh wait, that thing is
I just explain for it.
I wonder why did it say I don't know, I just added that now. Like, okay, these are just great. Okay, why does it say unknown?
All right, what is our root cap? What does it consist of? What does it do? Yeah, protects the meristem. Yeah, what else does it do? We just spent like a bunch of slides talking about. Protects the meristem and also
Perceive changes in gravity.
senses gravity. Yes, yes. So root cap, important in a couple of different, very important ways, right? Protecting the meristem so that the root can still grow. That meristem is cut away by the soils. We won't be able to grow new roots, right? But also perceives gravity. All right. What are those 4 steps in root gravitropism? What is the first step?
Perception.
Perception. Yes. What is happening there? We're perceiving something. Yeah, we're perceiving gravity or the change in gravity, right? Using those starch granules that are heavy and fall to one side of the cell. Next step. Transduction. What's going on there?
Sensing the amylocyte or amyloplast placement, and then like sending signal molecules so that
Yeah.
I can like go to the next step.
Exactly. We are sensing that those amyloplasts have fallen, and we are sending out some signals, which leads to our next step,
Transmission.
transmission. And what's happening in transmission?
The auxin's getting activated.
Yeah, those signaling molecules, they have activated auxin, right? Auxin's now flowing into our root cells and telling the plant which way to grow, which leads to our 4th step, which is
Response.
response. Yes, response, the way it's going to grow in response to how it perceives gravity. All right, what would you predict if we grew plants in microgravity and with light on all sides? What do you think would happen? Yeah, it would grow. I didn't realize the video had already answered this for us. I was hoping you would say, it would just kind of grow all over the place because it couldn't respond to anything, right? But the video does explain that even without light, even without gravity, there's this inherent direction that it will just grow away from where it's germinating. So plants are pretty incredible in that way. All right. We're going to move on to the last topic here, which is talking about pathogens, right? Pathogens and how plants defend themselves. So really nice tie into that space to ground video here, right? So pathogens tend to be microbes, right? So very small organisms like bacteria or fungi or viruses, right? They're any microbe that is carrying a disease, right? I have this nice illustration here, which I don't expect you to know what's going on here, but it shows a variety of different diseases that can be caused by these microbes, like this bacterial speck. There's like these little specks in the leaves here, right? These crown galls, right? Bacterial wilt, right? Whole host of diseases. Okay. Now these microbes are going to produce a compound called elicitors, right? And these elicitors are compounds that kind of promote the infection of the plant, right? So they're compounds used by these microbes to promote this disease infection of the plant. Right? So if they're producing these elicitors, right, these compounds, plants need a way to defend themselves against it, right? Otherwise, they would be helpless, right? So in order to defend themselves against these elicitors, there's a variety of different ways that a plant can do this, right? And I'm going to try to broadly talk about them, even though the way that plants defend themselves chemically can be very complicated, right? So elicitors, molecules that are produced by those pathogens, right? But plants have some strategies to kind of defend themselves against these disease-carrying pathogens, right? They have receptors on their plasma membranes, right, that can actually bind to different molecules secreted by the microbes and basically tells the plant that, hey, there is a microbe here, right? I need to do something about it, right? They can also essentially destroy the microbes, right? They can send out other compounds to fight these microbes, and a lot of times they're going to destroy the nucleic acids, which are building blocks of like DNA or even RNA, right? So kind of destroying the DNA of our viruses here. Right? But there's also receptors inside of the cell, right, that respond to these elicitors by triggering the production of some sort of a chemical defense or simply telling that cell that's infected to die so that the disease will not spread. Right? So there's a variety of different ways that this happens. Right? The plant can sense it in their plasma membrane. Right? They can physically destroy the DNA of our viruses. Right? Or they can go through a series of chemical reactions or simply tell that cell to die. Right? We are going to expand upon that last point there. Right? The production of those chemical defenses or programmed cell death. Right? And when I say expand, I'm still talking very basic. Right? We have not learned anything really about cell signaling or different proteins in our plasma membrane. I want to keep this very basic. All right. Plants can have this response called the hypersensitive response. Right? And this is where the plant is responding to those elicitors, right, with a series of different chemical responses. Right? And we can see in this image here that this can be a very complex process. Right? But the gist of it is that it can increase production of two different compounds, hydrogen peroxide being one, and nitric oxide being another. Right? These compounds will lead to some specific cell responses that we'll see on the next slide. Right? But they can also lead to productions of what's called secondary metabolites. Right? These secondary metabolites are molecules that can do a variety of things, right? It's hard to synthesize into one specific thing that they do, all right? They can produce a hormone that can be toxic, right? They can respond by increasing the amount of lignin in their cell walls. So the cell walls that weave, right? It's mostly cellulose, but they can respond by saying, let's put some more lignin in there. Let's make it even tougher to get through these cell walls. Right? So a variety of things. Right? I think this next slide is a little easier to understand what's actually going on because it's a very nice visual. Kind of breaks it down simply rather than that complex diagram on that previous slide. So we have our pathogen here. It's producing these elicitors, right? And in this case, there's two types of elicitors, right, that are being perceived nonetheless on the inside of our cell, right? So we're perceiving these elicitors a couple of different ways. But once these elicitors are perceived by the cell or recognized by the plant cell, the plant can produce hydrogen peroxide, this H2O2, right? And this hydrogen peroxide can actually kill the pathogens themselves or lead to more lignin in the cell walls, strengthening the cell walls, making it even harder for these viruses to get through those cell walls. Right? So that would be hydrogen peroxide. Right? But we can also produce this nitric oxide, right? And this can lead to these defense compounds, right? So compounds that can kill the pathogens, compounds that can even send signals to other parts of the plant to alert other cells that there's a virus invading my tissues and I need to respond. Right? But it can also lead to cell death. And we can see on this leaf here we have these necrotic spots. These spots where a patch of cells have simply died off. Right? And the plant does this because it doesn't want the pathogen to infect the entirety of the plant. Right? So by killing off certain sections, it's kind of containing the spread of any disease-carrying pathogens. Right, so lots of different physiological responses here. All right, plants can also have a systemic acquired resistance, right, rather than induced. Right? And this is the response of the whole plant, right? The response by producing these alarm signals, right? So the whole plant is kind of reacting to an invasion here. Right? An invasion is coming into maybe one part of the plant. The part is that plant is recognizing that there is an invasion happening of these microbes, and it's going to send some sort of alarm signal to the rest of the plant that is not being invaded yet. Right? It's kind of this communication strategy, right? That way the rest of the plant can basically start to defend itself before an attack even happens. Right? A really common way that plants do this is through this jasmonic acid. Right? This jasmonic acid is produced, and it's kind of, if we're thinking about going into the battle, it's like starting to fortify yourself before the enemy actually comes into your field of view, right? That way you're ready and you're prepared. But the whole plant is responding here, rather than the specific cells that are being attacked. All right. But the big question for a plant that they have to ask themselves is, are they going to defend or are they not going to defend? You might think that's crazy. Why wouldn't you defend against microbes, right? Well, sometimes a plant doesn't want to always spend the energy to be constantly defending itself, right? If they have these defenses that are always on, right, or always defending, we would say they're constitutive defenses. They're continuous, right? These are not going to be chemicals that are going to be made, These are not going to be immediately an immediate response to an attack. Rather, they are going to be structures that are always going to be present to help defend itself all the time. Right? So, like cell walls, right? That's a defense. Having waxy cuticles, right? Or really thick cuticles so that it's hard for microbes to get to the plant itself. Right? Bark, right? Bark is a constitutive defense, right? It helps defend the inside of the tree from anything getting to those precious growing cells. Right? Other constitutive defenses might be things like thorns, right? They might be things like, what am I thinking? I had a thought in my head and it just left me. But like thorns and spikes, right? Like cacti, right? Anything that's always present. Versus these induced defenses, right? Those previous defenses we talked about would fall under this category of induced defenses. Right? This is where the plants aren't only going to defend when it's needed, right? So instead of constantly producing these compounds that will fight off viruses, they're only going to produce those compounds when a virus is present, right? It saves the plant a lot of energy, right? It saves the plant a lot of resources, right? A lot of resources have to go into these defensive compounds, right? So by not having to always produce it, right, it saves the plant on a lot of that precious time, energy, and resource. Right? So again, those would be things like toxic chemicals, right, or compounds that can actually fight the pathogens, or deliberate cell death, like we talked about in those hypersensitive response mechanisms. All right, I have a couple of videos to end this lecture here, and I really like this video because it's so interesting. But this is how NASA is actually helping the wine industry. And it's a really nice. I wanted to move on to homework, which obviously is just studying for the exam on Monday. Next week, we'll look through the final project, right? And that'll be due on Friday. Your Martian soil lab report will be due, I think it's Wednesday. And we'll start doing some data analysis after the exam on Monday. And we have our last endurance discussion. Any questions? Yeah?
With the Martian lab report, are we doing that with our group or are we doing that individually?
That one is a group, yes.
Okay.
So all the group assignments are for the Martian soil lab report and the final project. Yep. Yep. Which is nice because the final lab report I have you do incorporates every single section of a lab report. So you notice we didn't write an introduction for this gravity lab report, right? The last one, you'll write the entirety of a lab report, but you'll have your whole group to help you, which is nice. All right, let's go to the greenhouse. Let's see. You can leave your stuff in here if you'd like, or you can bring it with you, but you'll likely have to leave it outside of the door because there's not a lot of space in the greenhouse. What was that? Bring a pencil. Yes, yes. I have an assignment here that I will pass around. It's really quite an